I am mindful particularly of those 43 students from Ayotzinapa in Mexico who have disappeared, who are presumed dead, all because, what did they do again? They assembled to protest austerity measures at their university, and they sought to commemorate those who stood bravely before them, protesting austerity measures, and were killed, and they were killed for that. So when we think about those students, to mourn their loss and to demand justice in their name, we are aware, I believe, that they were disappeared. Why? Because they assembled, because they invoked and exercised in a bodily way the right of association, the right to assembly, the right to speak their views. In English, we say they put their bodies on the line. They exercised the most basic rights of democracy, and yet they were treated as criminals, enemies of the state. Those losses deserve to be recognized, and the circumstances of their disappearance need to be publicly known. We can probably all agree on that. But why is this? Well, because they were lives that mattered and matter still, and they deserve to live those lives, and now they deserve to be mourned. I began my remarks this evening by suggesting that the debates about how to understand the body and how to understand the category of sex very often challenge our ideas of common sense. They contest our ideas of the body that has been shaped by the dominant norms of society. I suggested that it can be difficult to revise our ideas about what is natural and what is necessary when we think about gender and sexuality. I suggested as well that these theoretical debates become important when so many people who live outside the norm or in precarious situations struggle for recognition and support for their very lives. Indeed, I have spoken about at least 3 different groups, though they are sometimes overlapping: women, gender and sexual minorities, precarious populations, as well as those who gather openly to exercise their democratic rights, even when that means taking the risk that they will suffer violence and that they will die. So on one level, we're asking about the implicit idea of the body at work in certain kinds of political demands and mobilizations. At another level, we're trying to find out how mobilizations presuppose a body that requires support, popular and political support, but also infrastructural support, including economic and media support. In many of the public assemblies that draw people who understand themselves to be in precarious positions, they are asking for the food they need, the shelter they require, the ongoing employment that would make their life livable, the cultural, social, or political recognition that would allow them to participate in a common public world. These bodies, in showing their precarity, are also resisting the very powers that seek to minimize their powers and to minimize their participation in public life. Of course, if we make the matter individual, we can say that every single body has a certain right to food, shelter, freedom to move and breathe, protected from violence. Although we universalize in such a statement, every body has this right, we also particularize understanding the body as this body, as an individual matter, and that individual body is significantly shaped by a norm of what the body is and how it ought to be conceptualized. Of course, that seems quite obviously right, but consider that this idea of the individual body, a bodily subject of rights, it may fail to capture the sense of vulnerability, exposure, even dependency that's presupposed by the right itself, and which corresponds, I want to suggest, with an alternative view of the body that I suggested earlier, a relational view, a view of the body as living and relational. In other words, if we accept that part of what a body is, and this is for me an ontological claim, part of what a body is its dependency on other bodies and networks of support, then we're suggesting that it's not altogether right to conceive of individual bodies as completely distinct from one another. Of course, neither are they blended into some amorphous social body, but if we cannot readily conceptualize the political meaning of the human body without understanding those relations in which it lives and thrives, we fail to make the best possible case for the various political ends we seek to achieve. So what I'm suggesting is that it is not just that this or that body is bound up in a network of relations, but that the body, despite its clear boundaries, or perhaps precisely by virtue of those boundaries, is defined by the relations that make its own life and action possible, right? We think about the boundary of the body. We might understand it to contain us. This is the boundary of my body. You know, don't smoke near me, or don't stand near me, or whatever it is we do when we privatize our body as a contained kind of element. But actually, the boundary of the body is also the skin that exposes us to touch. It exposes us to visibility, to audibility. It articulates us as a social creature, not just as an individual. Well, what difference does it make if we understand the body in the terms that I propose? Well, I want to suggest that if we understand bodies as defined, for instance, by their sociality, their interdependency, that means that this body, this one, cannot really exist without another body, without another world of bodies. The I, this I requires a you in order to survive and even to flourish. We are bound to one another socially in important ways. I cannot live without living together with some set of people. And the most individual struggles with survival are always also social struggles. What kind of infrastructure, what kind of services are available? For what kind of world is it in which disenfranchisement is accepted as a necessary way of life? I want to suggest that we cannot let such ordinary ways of thinking limit our own political imaginations. So let me say a few words on how my work on gender performativity has led to my most recent work on precarity. Was precarity always there in gender trouble, or did I take a new turn? Butler took a new turn. I want to say yes to both of those questions. To say that gender is performative is to say that it is a certain kind of enactment. The appearance of gender is often mistaken as a sign of its internal or inherent truth. Gender is prompted by obligatory norms that we materialize in our daily life, or we fail to materialize in our daily life, or we materialize in ways that we weren't exactly supposed to do. But those obligatory norms demand that we become one gender or another, usually within a strictly binary frame. The reproduction of gender is thus always a negotiation with this norm, this obligation, this exercise of power. There is no gender without the reproduction of norms that risks undoing or redoing the norm in unexpected ways, opening up the possibility of a remaking of gendered reality along new lines. The political aspiration of this analysis is found in the call to let the lives of gender and sexual minorities become more possible and more livable for bodies who are gender non-conforming, as well as those who conform too well and at a high cost, to be able, as I have said, to breathe and move more freely in public and private spaces, as well as all the sites that cross those two. The theory of gender performativity never prescribed which gender performances were right. It never said which performances would be more subversive than other performances, and it never said which gender performances were wrong and reactionary. In fact, it's an amoral theory. Okay, gender performativity is an amoral theory. The point, not immoral, okay, amoral. The point was precisely to relax the coercive hold of norms on gendered life, which is not the same as transcending all those norms for the purposes of living a more livable life. I want to suggest to you that precarity has always been in this picture, since gender performativity was a theory and a practice that opposed the unlivable conditions in which gender minorities live, and sometimes also those gender majorities who passed as normative at a very high psychic and somatic cost. Precarity designates that politically induced condition in which certain populations suffer from failing social and economic networks of support more than others, and become differentially exposed to injury, violence, and death. Precarity is the differential distribution of precariousness. Populations that are differentially exposed suffer heightened risk of disease, poverty, starvation, displacement, and vulnerability to violence without adequate protection or redress. Precarity also characterizes that politically induced condition of maximized vulnerability and exposure for populations exposed to arbitrary state violence, to street or domestic violence, or other forms not enacted by states, but which the judicial instruments of states fail to provide sufficient protection or redress for. So by precarity, we may be talking about populations who lack sufficient food, or whose food sources arrive one day but not the next, or are carefully rationed. Or we may be talking about populations where housing is suddenly lost or utterly lost. We witness now the important anti-eviction movement in Spain. Let it spread. We might also be talking about transgendered sex workers who have to defend themselves against street violence and police harassment, or we might be talking about the gay, lesbian, queer people in Moscow who were just recently beaten up quite brutally by the police for doing what? For assembling and trying to celebrate gay pride. Sometimes these are the same groups, sometimes they're overlapping. But when they are part of the same population, they can be linked by their sudden or protracted subjection to precarity, and their resolve to resist that condition. And the question for us, and maybe the question for a radical democratic left, is how can they be linked? How can these various populations be linked over time? What brings them together? What allows them to arrive together, to assemble together? In this way, I want to suggest that precarity is directly linked with gender norms, since we know that those who do not live their genders in intelligible ways are at heightened risk for harassment, pathologization, and violence. Gender norms have everything to do with how and in what way we can appear in public space, how and in what way the public and the private are distinguished, and how that distinction is instrumentalized in the service of sexual politics. Who will be criminalized on the basis of their public appearance? By which I mean who will be treated as a criminal and produced as a criminal, which is not always the same as being named criminal by a code of law that discriminates against manifestations of certain gender norms or certain sexual practices. So criminalization can happen both in codified ways within law, but also in non-juridical ways that can have equally violent effects. Who will fail to be protected by the law, or more specifically, the police, on the street or on the job or in the home, in legal codes or religious institutions? Who will be stigmatized and disenfranchised at the same time that they become the object of fascination and consumer pleasure? Who will have medical benefits before the law? Whose intimate and kinship relations will be recognized before the law or criminalized by the law, or indeed may shift quite radically depending on which legal code is in operation, religious or secular, or whether or not the tension between legal codes happens to be resolved.